It may have taken us almost a month to the day, but we finally created a recommended dry setup for every track in F1 24. It took us a little longer than planned, mainly due to a pretty big overhaul in the handling just a week after the game launched, which required completely new setups for 10 tracks. And yes, I am still a little bit salty about this because it meant I had to visit Monaco twice. Thanks EA. But even bigger news is that we've just hit 90,000 subscribers. And I want to say a huge thanks to everyone who's watched our videos over the past few years and for those who have subscribed. Those of you who haven't subscribed, which is over 67% of viewers, come on, what are you waiting for? If you're feeling kind, hit that subscribe button and put us on our way to 100,000 subscribers. I wanted to round out our dry F1 24 setup series by creating one huge monster video with all setups in one place. If you're working through a career mode or online league, bookmark this video, and you can check back throughout your season to grab the setup you need. Now you're going to hear my past self as I'm going to let all setups play in calendar order, and I'll leave timestamps in the description below so you guys can quickly jump about to the track and the setup you need. And one last thing, go on, hit that subscribe button, you know you want to. Kicking things off with the aero setup, I have increased the front aero and decreased the rear after the handling patch. This creates a much bigger gap between front and rear wings, allowing for a more responsive car, and this will eliminate a lot of the understeer that was added after the update. Go with 36 on the front and 26 on the rear wing aero. For the differential, I've set the on throttle to 40, and this is a touch lower than our original car setup, but traction is a touch harder to find after the patch, so decreasing the on throttle diff can help a little bit when you're accelerating out those slower corners. If you can handle a more oversteer happy car, try increasing the on throttle setup slightly and it should give you a little bit of a performance gain. Set the off throttle diff pretty neutral at 55 and the engine braking at 70%. After the update, we can opt for a much higher engine braking setup, and this will help in a few ways. First off, it naturally slows the car down a bit faster and it also boosts our ERS recovery during a race. Now, since the update, a camber setup of left-left is almost always beneficial. This is the route that pretty much every time trial setup went, and it can now be echoed across into race setups. Tyre wear can be managed at most tracks using tyre pressures, so a maxed out camber, which means all the way to the left, will help with much more performance. Then set the toe to 0.1 and 0.2. Increasing the rear toe compared to the front will just stabilise the rear of the car a little bit through the faster corners. The suspension setup isn't too dissimilar to what I ran before, a stiffer front end and softer rear, so set the suspension to 37 and 4, and then increase the anti-roll bars to 13 and 10. Higher anti-roll bar setups are better after the handling update, however I still don't think we can run a time trial-esque ARB setup of 21-21 in a race. I've then slightly increased the ride height to 24 and 58 compared to our pre-patch setup. With the brakes, it's now much harder to lock a wheel after the update. This allows us to boost our brake pressure to 100% for most tracks and run a more forward brake bias of 55%. Finally, the tyre pressures are one area that I've adjusted a lot since our pre-patch Bahrain setup. The rear tyres will wear significantly faster around Bahrain compared to the front, and this means we should lower the front pressures to a pretty normal setup of 24.5 and 25 psi. However, we have to run our rear pressures at their maximum pressure to reduce tyre wear. But jumping right in, I've gone with an aero setup of 25 and 13. This is a much larger wing gap than our original pre-patch car setup, and is designed to reduce understeer and make the car respond a lot better. If you're finding the rear of the car a little bit too loose, you can increase the rear wing up to say 15, although this shouldn't really be an issue. I've then set the on-throttle diff at 75% and 55% on the off-throttle diff. Both of these settings have been increased since the updated handling. Something else that has been increased is the engine braking, which I have bumped right up to 70%. This is a pretty huge increase over our old car setup, and there's even an argument for setting this closer to 100%. Although for races and stability and consistency, I found that 70% works really well without introducing any real negatives. Much like our updated Bahrain car setup, I've set the camber far left for both front and rear. This works well with the large aero gap to make your car really turn into corners, something that was heavily nerfed with the updated handling. For the toe, go with 0.05, 0.17, with the higher rear toe helping with some rear stability. Oversteer is a little bit more likely since the update, so adding some extra toe at the rear can help your car keep in line through those fast corner sequences. I've once again chosen a stiff front suspension and softer rear. I opted for 38 at the front this time and just 5 at the rear, and this makes for a really responsive car, which is crucial through those fast chicanes around Jeddah. For the anti-roll bars, I've gone with 16 and 11, which is much higher than our old setup. Stiffer ARBs will give your car more mechanical grip mid-corner by eliminating body roll. Then round out the suspension setup by setting the ride height at 23 and 58. The main adjustment here was to increase the rear ride height to create a bit more rake in the car, and this helps with pretty much everything, including limiting any bottoming out if you ride up and over one of the large curbs through the first sector, and reducing any kind of snap oversteer that you may have. For the brake setup, I've kept the brake bias at 54%, which is ideal for Jeddah for both time trial and races. I've then boosted the brake pressure up to 100% after the update, with the tyre pressures going at 28.5 and 27.5 psi on the front and 26.5 on both rears. This approach will keep your tyres cool throughout the full race distance. The front left tyre will typically stay a lot cooler than all the other tyres at Jeddah, just because there's less load going through that tyre around a lap. So I've reduced the tyre pressure on that one single tyre to try and get a bit more heat into it. And this will round out our updated Jeddah car setup. Now I'm not going to mess around, I'm going to kick things straight off and go with an aero setup of 30 and 20. I've increased the front wing and decreased the rear wing slightly after the updated handling patch, and this does result in slightly more downforce orientated setup. However, we can mitigate some of the extra drag in other parts of our car setup. For the transmission, I've opted for 35% on throttle. This is pretty low for a car setup, but the final sequence of corners really does benefit from kind of 35%. If you set your on throttle diff much higher, that final corner can get really slippery. For the off throttle, go with 60%. Now you don't want to set this too low post the 1.3 patch to avoid too much over rotation of the apex. Then go with 70% engine braking, which is much like our Bahrain and Jeddah setups and is much higher than before the patch. I've set the geometry with the camber all the way to the left on the front and rear for the best mechanical grip, and I've set the toe out to 0.08 and toe in to 0.24. Typically you want both of these toe values set pretty low. However, through the slower corners, the rear of the car can get a little bit twitchy, especially through that final corner. Increasing the rear toe to 0.24 goes some way towards keeping the rear of the car more stable. When it comes to the suspension, there's definitely a trend in F124 car setups following the update. An extremely stiff front suspension and really soft rear is definitely the way to go. For this setup, go with 38 and 4 and then 16 and 10 on the anti-roll bars, and set the ride height to 23 and 58. This suspension setup is a more aggressive approach compared to our pre-patch setup, and it's designed to keep your car on its toes and responding well. Then set the brake pressure as high as you feel comfortable with. After the update, I typically go all the way up to 100% with the pressure, and around Melbourne I've kept the brake bias at 55%. And finally, your tyres. Now, they will get hot around Albert Park due to the fast corners, with the rear tyres being more susceptible to overheating. Set the rear pressures to maximum and lower the fronts to 27.5 and 28.5 psi. The gap from left to right is to simply try and keep the front right tyre in the correct temperature window, as this is the tyre that will cool the fastest. And that will round out our updated Australian car setup for F124 following the 1.3 handling patch. Kicking things off with this updated setup is the Aero, and I've gone with wing angles of 39 and 28. Now this is a big increase compared to our pre-patch setup, giving us a lot more front downforce than before. This is needed since Suzuka is so reliant on your car's ability to turn in well to those sweeping corners. If you do find the car a little bit too loose, you can reduce the front aero by a couple of clicks to bring the balance more towards the rear of the car. This will sacrifice some outright performance and make the car a little bit more prone to understeer, but it will be more manageable during a full race distance. I've opted for just 25% on the on-throttle differential setup. Now this is actually a reduction from our original car setup, as traction is now much harder to find. Exiting the slow corners of 11 and 17 in particular are very tough on traction, and it's incredibly easy to spin your rear wheels. If you don't mind a bit of management throughout a race, you can manually increase your on-throttle differential up to say 40, 50, 60% or so during other parts of the lap, and lower it back down just before these two corners. Then go 40% off-throttle differential for a good amount of rotation and 60% engine braking. The suspension geometry doesn't look too dissimilar to our previous updated car setups. I've set the camber far left at -3.5 and -2.2, and the toe follows our current trend of low front toe and low to medium rear. Go 0.05 and 0.25 with the toe setup. Now that extra rear toe is really designed to keep the rear of the car stable, which is especially important due to our aggressive aero setup. The suspension setup is crucial around Suzuka, especially since the update in F124. Like our previous Bahrain, Jeddah, Australia setups, I've stiffened the front suspension up to 40 and I've set the rear suspension to just 5. This is pretty standardized for tracks now, especially Suzuka, since the style of the corners of this circuit really require greater responsiveness from your car. The anti-roll bars are set roughly in the middle with a priority on stiffer front ARBs. I've gone with 16 and 10 this time round. Then I've rounded out our suspension setup by setting the ride height to 25 and 60. For the brakes, I've gone 99% brake pressure this time. There are a few corners where you can easily snatch a brake and lock a wheel at Suzuka, which is why I've lowered the pressure by 1 click. I've then gone with a brake bias setup at 54%. If you do experience too many lockups still during those short and sharp braking zones, you can reduce the brake pressure even more or move the brake bias slightly further rearward. You do have to look after your tyres around Suzuka, so I've opted for a setup of 27.5 psi on both fronts and the maximum 26.5 on both rears. And that will round out this Japanese car setup. For the aero setup, I've gone with a front wing of 33 and a rear wing of just 20. This is a large wing gap, and many time trial or esports car setups will increase this gap even further. This large wing gap is designed to give us good responsiveness and eliminate understeer, which can cause you to lose a lot of time through the faster corners at Shanghai. If this setup is a little bit too twitchy or a little bit too on edge, try either reducing the front wing a couple of points or increasing the rear wing a couple of points. For the transmission, I've set the on-throttle diff pretty low at just 40. This is due to the slower speed corners where traction can be really hard to find. Now the off-throttle diff is also a little lower at 35%, which is designed for good rotation, but if you find your car over-rotates at the slower corners, such as the slow hairpin at the end of the long straight, you may want to increase your off-throttle differential a little bit. This will introduce a touch more understeer, but it can really help stabilise the rear of the car during these slower corners. I've then left the engine braking at a medium to high setting of 70%. For the suspension geometry, I've set the camber all the way left to -3.5, -2.2. Tyre wear can be a bit of an issue around China, but we can really combat that with other parts of our setup, and a camber all the way to the left will just give us more outright performance. I've reduced the front toe right down to 0 and opted for a low toe at the rear of just 0.18. This approach will minimise drag compared to running more toe, but the rear toe in will add some stability through turns 3 and 13 where the car can be prone to oversteering. For the suspension setup, go with 40 and 6 and then opt for 16 and 10 on the ARBs. Increasing this further will increase the responsiveness of your car, but can make it harder to handle when laying down the power out of some of the faster corners. I've set the ride height to 23 and 55, and as long as you don't fully mount the curbs at the exit of turns 10 and 13, this ride height won't be too low. I've set the brake pressure to 100% like normal after the handling update, and set the front bias to 55%. Finally, go with tyre pressure to 28.5 and 29.5 on the front and 26.5 on both rear tyres. This approach is designed to lower tyre wear through longer races, which can really be an issue at this circuit. The combination of slow corners with heavy traction zones and sustained higher speed corners is really the perfect combination to hurt your tyre wear during a race. Like so many tracks in F124, it is advisable not to use the soft tyres during a long race, as they'll just wear too fast to be effective. Starting with the aero, I've gone with wings of 24 and 13, and this is slightly lower than our pre-patch car setup. It's targeted at really just loosening the rear of the car a little bit more after the handling patch. The move to a low downforce car setup ensures we're competitive down that incredibly long straight. I found that the car is incredibly quick through the twisty parts of the track compared to the AI, even when set to 110, and you can really gain a lot of time through the slow turns 11 to 16 sequence. If you're trying for a fast time trial or qualifying time, I'd recommend adding say 5 to 10 points to both the front and rear wings, bringing them to something like 30 and 17 for example. With the transmission, I've set the on-throttle diff on the lower side at 35%, which will help with traction out of the slower corners. You do need to watch your throttle input out of 17 as things can still get really loose. I've then set the off-throttle at 35% for good rotation and the engine braking at 70%. For the geometry, go with the camber far left at -3.5 and -2.2, and this will be the norm for pretty much every setup so far and will continue with the remaining tracks. Then opt for a toe setup of 0 on the front and 0.11 on the rear. Set the front suspension to 40 and the rear to just 5, which is a pretty huge offset, but it does really help the front of the car remain incredibly responsive, and the rear still remains compliant. Then opt for anti-roll bars of 16 and 10, and these are higher than our pre-patch setup, and it's designed to give us more mechanical grip. For the ride height, I kept things balanced, if not a little on the higher side at 24 and 58. Go with 100% brake pressure like normal, and a brake bias of 55%. And you can move this down to 54 if you experience any front wheel lock-in, but 55% is a good balance through an entire lap if you prefer to just set it and forget it. Now I've gone with tyre pressures of 29 and 28 psi on the front tyres. In this year's game, uneven tyre wear and different temperatures between left and right sides is a real big issue, so it's why I quite often set uneven tyre pressures on the front of the car. Then I've gone with 26.5 psi on both rear tyres, and that will round out our updated Miami car setup. Kicking things off, I've gone with an aero setup of 38 for the front wing and 23 for the rear. This is a really big increase compared to our pre-handling patch and leans more towards a time trial setup approach. You will be sacrificing a couple of miles an hour down the pit straight, however this setup will make your car lightning fast through the corners, allowing you to put in much faster lap times than the AI. If you do find the car too easy or too comfortable to drive, you can lower the front and rear aero a little bit more to give you better top speed. This will loosen the car a bit and sacrifice some outright lap time, but it can make overtaking and defending easier during a race. With the transmission, go with 60% on throttle. Now finding traction is harder after the handling update, but I've actually increased the on throttle differential for our Imola car setup this time around. This gives much better drive out of the faster corners, and there aren't really too many corners at Imola where traction is a big issue. The off-throttle diff is still set to 50 just like our original car setup, and I've set the engine braking to 80%. Imola really isn't a track that's really punishing on your tyres, so we can go super aggressive on our camber, going all the way to the left. To be fair, if Imola was harder on tyre wear, I still think I'd recommend going this route as it is much faster. For the toe, I've opted for 0.11 on the front and 0.2 on the rear, for a nice combination of stability and relatively minimal drag. Carrying on our aggressive setup approach, I've gone with the suspension at 41 and 9. This gives really good rotation at the front of the car while keeping the rear compliant. I've continued the trend to the ARBs, keeping them relatively high enough at 14 and 9. Going higher, like 21 and 16 for example, can yield better cornering performance, but it will start to wear the tyres a little bit more and make the car feel a little bit more prone to snapping during a race. Now you'll be hitting the large curbs at pretty much every corner around Imola, so keeping a little bit of height in your ride height is important. I found that 25 and 58 works really well, allowing for good performance while not making the car too skittish over those big curbs. This suspension setup is really designed to allow you to attack the track, hitting the curbs aggressively. Hopping over the curbs at the chicane for example can really gain you a lot of lap time. For the brake setup, I've once again opted for 100% brake pressure and lowered the brake bias down to 53%. Many of the corners are pretty short and have fast braking zones, which does really benefit from a more rearward bias. Now the tyre pressures are designed to ensure that the tyres do not overheat during a race. Opt for 24 and 23 psi in the front to help get a bit more temperature, and then go with 24.5 psi on both rears. And that will round out this updated Imola car setup at F1 24. The next track to receive the updated car setup treatment in F124 is Monaco, and this isn't one of my favourites. So I'm going to kick things off pretty quickly with the aero setup, and it's no real surprise that I've gone 50 on both front and rear wings. Pre-patch I ran 49 on the rear wing, but since the traction is much harder to find after the handling update, I've upped this to 50 just to give as much rear kind of traction stability as possible. I've also adjusted the transmission setup quite a lot after the handling update. I've set all three setup options to 50%. This is a boost to everything all round, but the extra rear wing aero allows us to slightly increase the on-throttle diff for better drive out of the corners. With all of the slower corners around a lap, over-rotation can be a big issue at Monaco. This has led me to also boost the off-throttle diff to 50% to stop the car from kind of almost drifting or over-rotating at slower speeds. I've also boosted the engine braking to 50% to try and slow the car a little bit more aggressively. Setting up a car for Monaco is really a challenge during the braking phase. You can easily over-rotate the car during the braking by opting for a rearward brake bias or too much engine braking, so 50% engine braking is about as high as I'd want to go before this becomes too much of an issue. With our geometry, I've taken a leaf right out of the time trial setup playbook with a almost completely left approach. I have increased the rear toe a little bit to 0.1 to kind of add a little bit more stability to the rear of the car. I've then gone ahead and set our suspension to 39 and 9, which creates a stiff front for good responsiveness and initial turning while keeping the rear of the car really soft for stability. I've also boosted the ARBs a lot since our pre-patch setup goes 16 and 12, and this will help reduce some of that understeer that was introduced, but it can make the car feel a little bit slipperier at times. If you are struggling too much with oversteer mid-corner, try softening the ARBs a little bit. Then go 25 and 58 for your ride height, which is more than high enough so the bumpy track surface doesn't upset your car's balance. As I just mentioned, your setup should be heavily designed around the braking phase of the corner. I've opted for 100% brake pressure and just 53% bias. Even with this more rearward brake bias setup, you can still easily lock a front wheel, especially into turn 18. However, moving this down to 51 or 52% will start to introduce over-rotation at the rear of the car, and this can lead to a quick meeting with the wall. So finally, our tyre pressures are created to just manage tyre wear through a race. Go with 23 psi on both fronts to ensure they're hot enough during the race, and 24.5 psi on both rears. Now that Monaco's out of the way, we can focus on updating our Canadian car setup for F124. This is really one of my favourite tracks. It's a fast circuit, not too dissimilar to places like Jeddah, and it'll really test your car's kind of overall balance and rear stability quite a lot. After the handling patch, which introduced a lot of understeer and kind of took away some of that pointiness, this updated car setup is really a challenge of creating a car that's as loose as possible before the rear of it starts to become too much of a problem. This style of setup will allow you to rotate your car really well into the fast corners and carry high minimum corner speeds. But if you go too loose or go too aggressive like a time trial setup, during a race you can really struggle with consistency, especially as your tyre wear starts to kick in. Now I've set the aero to 33 and 24, which is a reduction compared to our pre-patch car setup, mainly at the rear of the car. As I mentioned, the goal is to really lower the rear wing as much as possible before we start to lose the rear end of the car, especially through turn 2 and the fast chicane of turn 8 and 9. These are two of the trickiest parts of the circuit. The larger the gap between front and rear aero, the more rotation you'll experience. Now I've set the on-throttle differential at 40%, which may seem a little bit strange for a high-speed track, but as we're playing with the limitations of rear grip, we don't want to set this too high, otherwise this combined with low rear aero will just make the rear of the car squirm all over the place. I've then set the off-throttle diff really low at 25%, which will allow a good amount of rotation into slower corners, and I've gone with engine braking of 40%. For the geometry setup, mid-corner speed is crucial. To achieve this, I've gone all the way left on the camber, and I've set the toe to just 0.07 at the front and 0.1 at the rear. This adds a little bit of stability at the rear of the car, a little bit of responsiveness at the front of the car, but it's not too much overall drag that will slow our car too much in a straight line. Now I've gone with 40 and 7 on the suspension setup, with the aim to create a really responsive car, because understeer will just absolutely kill your lap time around Canada. I've set the ARBs to 15 and 13. I would have liked to set them higher, as this will yield more performance. However, the higher you go, turn 2 in particular becomes increasingly more difficult. If you're looking for a time trial setup, increase your ARBs to say 21 and 17 would be a really good option to get a bit more performance. Then for this setup, set your ride height to 24 and 57, which is actually exactly the same as our original pre-patch Canada setup. With the brake setup, I found that 100% pressure works in almost all scenarios, including this one after the handling update. Then opt for just 52% brake bias, which, much like our ride height, is exactly the same as our original car setup. And then for the tyre pressures, your rear tyres are the ones that will get hit the most and hurt during a race. The constant requirement for good traction out of the faster corners and the tyre slip that's been introduced with this car setup will really build temperature at the rear of the car. To combat this, I've gone tyre pressures which are much higher at the rear than they are at the front. Go 22.5 psi on both front tyres to make sure they get up to temperature during a race, and then 24.5 psi on both rears. And that will complete this updated Canadian car setup for F1 24. I'm going to kick things off quickly with a aero setup of 42 and 31, which is quite similar to our original car setup. If you do want a time trial-esque setup, you can go with wings of 50 and 35 to 40 on the rear to really maximise your speed through the corners. However, we can't really use this high downforce approach during a race due to the AI's blistering straight line speed. I've set the transmission to 60% for the on-throttle differential, and this gives us a really good push out of the faster corners. Then go with 40% off-throttle diff and 70% engine braking. The lower off-throttle diff setup will help rotate the car in the slower corners, and the 70% engine braking will give us really good ERS recovery. Now, no matter which setup you'll go with, Spain is going to really just wear your tyres out. So let's embrace that and go with a pretty aggressive camber setup of left and left. I've then set the toe to 0 and 0.05 on the rear for kind of minimal drag, help with our straight line speed a little bit. As with most of our reworked F1 24 setups so far, a really stiff front suspension and soft rear will give you the fastest car. Opt for 41 and 4 and then set your anti-roll bars to 18 and 12. This is a more aggressive and stiffer setup compared to our pre-patch setup, and it's designed to really help the car rotate through the corners and allow it to be a bit more responsive. Through these long corners, stiffer ARBs such as a time trial approach of 21-21 will make your car more prone to oversteering, so I found that 18 and 12 is a good mixture of performance while ensuring your car remains stable during longer races. I've then set the ride height to 27 and 56, which is the same as our pre-patch setup, and I've gone with a brake setup of 100% pressure like normal and the bias a little bit more rearward at 52%. This combination, along with the higher engine braking setup, will yield better overall braking performance after the patch. It is incredibly easy to snatch a brake, especially into turn 5, which is why I've chosen the more rearward bias. With the tyre pressures, there's really only one way to go, and that's to max out all pressures. As I mentioned, Spain's going to destroy your tyres no matter what, so max out your pressures just to kind of mitigate some of that wear as much as you can. So go ahead and set your aero to 36 and 22. This is a large offset between front and rear wing, and it will let your car be really nice and pointy during the initial turn-in phase of a corner. It's not too overly aggressive, with a good time trial car setup opting for slightly more aggressive wings of 40 and 20. This is a much larger wing gap that would let your car rotate quicker, but does create a harder to drive car due to the lower rear aerodynamics. The rest of our car setup will balance rear stability, allowing us to really throw the car into corners without worrying too much about the rear of the car stepping out of line. Now, with a setup of 36 and 22, you may find that you're lacking a couple of miles an hour down the straights compared to the AI. However, you will be so much faster during the corners. If you get to the front of the grid, you're going to be able to simply drive away from the AI, which I could do even with the AI set to 110. Now, I've opted for a 60% on-throttle differential for good traction and 45% off-throttle setup. This gives you a good push out the fast corners, and traction out of turn 3 isn't really too hard to find this year, which actually lets us run a slightly higher on-throttle diff setup. Then set the engine braking aggressively high at 80% for really good recovery and a little bit better deceleration. Now we want to aim for really good minimum corner speeds at the Red Bull Ring, so go with your camber all the way left like normal. Then opt for a tow setup of 0.05 on both front and rear. This keeps the car stable at the rear while giving a little bit of a boost to our responsiveness. If you do plan on running a higher front wing for a time trial setup, you can remove all front tow. Now the suspension setup starts with a front set of 40 and rear set to 6. I've then gone pretty low with the anti-roll bars at 11 and 9, which is designed to help keep the rear of the car stable through the longer corners. Increasing this does make the car a little bit more twitchy and prone to snapping mid-corner. Then go with the ride height of 26 and 56, which is high enough to let you ride up and over the curbs around Austria. Now opt for 100% brake pressure like normal and a brake bias of 55%. There are only really 3 big braking zones around the Red Bull Ring, and each one of these benefit from a more forward brake bias setup. You shouldn't really find yourself locking a wheel under braking with a bias of 55%. With the tyre pressures, run them all at maximum other than the front right. I've decreased this down to 28.5 psi as it can actually struggle for tyre temperature as it's not really used during a lap of the Red Bull Ring. Starting with the aerodynamic setup, I've opted for an approach of 33 and 24. Silverstone's incredibly high speed, however to put in the fastest lap times you will need a good amount of downforce. It's quite similar to the Red Bull Ring in that way that despite the fast track layout, more downforce is actually beneficial. Reducing your aero setup will result in higher top speeds on the approach to Stowe and Brooklands, but you will lose more performance through the twisty bits. Following our Austrian car setup, the transmission also looks very similar. An on-throttle diff setup of 60% provides good traction without resulting in a car that's too prone to snapping under acceleration. The off-throttle differential is set to 40% for good slow speed rotation, and the engine braking of 70% is really quickly becoming my favourite setup approach. With pretty much all F1 24 car setups now, setting the camber all the way left is the fastest option, regardless of which track you're at. You can move the camber further right if you do ever find tyre wear is an issue, but you will lose a little bit of performance. Then set your tow to 0 at the front and 0.17 at the rear. This is designed to keep the rear of the car a little bit more stable through the slower corners such as Luffield. And I look at this as almost a little bit of a safety net that prevents the rear of the car from over-rotating or losing traction quite as often. I've set the suspension to 38 and 5 for really good responsiveness and gone with high anti-roll bars of 18 and 13. This is among the highest I've used up until now and is due to the incredibly fast direction changes. This stiff approach will keep your car planted and can greatly improve your mid-corner speed. Go with a ride height of 26 and 58, and this is generally as low as we can really go around Silverstone. You've got to be aware of a few nasty bumps, especially the one on the right of the track on the straight just before Brooklands. This bump in particular will cause your car to hit the track and you'll lose a little bit of speed. Now our brake setup is pretty normal with 100% pressure and 55% brake bias. This approach is good around Silverstone and F1 24 as it provides great deceleration without really risking a front lockup. And rounding out this F1 24 car setup are the tyre pressures. I've set all pressures to maximum other than the front right, which I've lowered to 28.5 psi, just to help it get a bit of temperature during the race. If you do find yourself suffering from too much tyre wear with any of our setups, there are a few things you can change. You could soften your anti-roll bars, soften your front suspension, and reduce the amount of camber you run. All of these things will result in slightly less pure performance, but they can help manage your tyre wear and temperatures a little bit better. So with such a high downforce car setup required, it's no surprise I've set the front wing aero to 50, and I've set the rear wing to 40. Having an offset of around 10 points is beneficial around Hungary to really promote better rotation. This isn't the case with our Monaco setup, as that circuit is so reliant on rear stability and just having as much downforce as possible. At the Hungary ring in F1 24, the best aero setup approach really tailors the car to responsiveness and rotation. With our transmission setup, we have to focus on not spinning your rear wheels when accelerating from slow speeds. So I've set the on-throttle differential to 55%, which is kind of middling, which provides good drive out of the faster corners, while also managing tyre slip and wheel spin at slower speeds. Then go with 40% off throttle and 60% for the engine braking. You can't really be too aggressive with these values, as the Hungaroring really tests your car's stability. With the geometry setup, I've once again got the camber all the way to the left for the best mechanical grip mid-corner. I've lowered the front toe right down to its minimum and set the rear toe in to 0.05 for a little bit of added stability. The suspension setup is a little bit less stiff than at some other tracks. I've got the front suspension at 36 and the rear at 6, which is still plenty stiff enough. However, it's tailored a little bit more towards stability and drivability. I have kept the anti-roll bar set up fairly high at 16 and 13 to keep the car planted during those fast direction changes. Then I set the ride height to 25 and 55, which is high enough to allow you to attack the tracks and the curbs. You can even really bounce over those high curves at the chicane to try and shorten the corner a little bit. Just be careful not to touch the inside curb at some key corners such as turns 1 and 11, as these can really destabilise your car's balance. Opt for a brake pressure setup of 100% for maximum braking performance and a bias of 54%. Generally, at slower tracks like Monaco and Hungary, a more rearward brake bias is preferred, as it can be easier to lock a tyre at slower speeds. Moving the bias rearwards can just help prevent this a little bit. Then set your tyre pressures to 27 and 27.5 psi at the front, just to help manage tyre wear and temperature, and set the rear pressures to their maximum. We'll try and ensure the rear tyres don't overheat or wear too fast. I've opted for a setup of 18 for the front wing and just 4 at the rear. The reworked Spa track is incredibly fluid to drive, and while it does test your mechanical grip through fast corners, rear downforce is never truly an issue. You could, in fact, lower the rear downforce even closer to 0 if you do feel the car isn't too hard to control. The front wing of 18 is much more important than the rear, as you don't want to suffer from understeer, as this will harm your mid-corner speed a lot. There aren't too many slow corners where traction is an issue around Spa, other than the final chicane and the first corner. This lets us run a higher on-throttle diff setup of 70%, without too much worry of the car feeling loose. I'd suggest lowering this manually via your MFD on the approach to the final chicane, and increasing it back up after turn 1. This can make it slightly easier to accelerate without spinning your rear wheels through those slower corners. I've then gone and set the off-throttle diff to 35% and the engine braking to 70. This approach gives us maximum ERS recovery each lap and great deceleration. The combination provides very good deceleration without the rear of the car feeling unstable under heavy braking. Spa is a track that is all about minimising drag and maximising mechanical grip, and that leads to only one outcome, and that's to run the camber all the way to the left combined with minimal toe. Increasing the rear toe can provide a bit more stability, but as I mentioned, rear stability and rear downforce isn't really the issue around Spa, so I'd suggest keeping it all the way left. The fairly aggressive trend does continue to the suspension setup, setting this to 40 at the front and 5 at the rear, and pairing this with an ARB setup of 20 and 16 means your car will be pretty stiff. This is great for carrying higher speed through corners such as Les Combes and Pouhon. I have lowered the rear ARB for better stability, which just helps eliminate any snap oversteer. With this stiff suspension, we can also run a low ride height of 24 and 56, and this could actually even be lower. However, I have included a bit of a buffer, as you can bottom out if you get up and over some curbs, such as the outside curb on the final part of Les Combes. Now, there are some curbs to avoid around Spa, mainly the inside curbs of turns 14 and 16, as these can start to rotate your car. With the brake setup, 100% pressure is a must to slow your car from high speed into that chicane, and then go with a brake bias of 55%. We are running the off-throttle diff relatively low and the engine braking pretty high, which means we have to move the brake bias slightly further forward. Even at 55%, there is still almost zero chance of locking a wheel. And I've rounded out this F124 Belgium car setup with tyre pressures set to their maximum. The rears will heat up quicker than the fronts, and if you struggle for warm-up on the harder tyre, you can lower the front pressures by 1 or even 2 psi. Starting this car setup is the aero, and you have to run things pretty high at Zandvoort. I wouldn't recommend setting the front wing and rear wing angles to Monaco levels, as there is a pretty long straight that we need to consider. I have still gone for 46 for the front wing aero and 35 at the rear. This offset promotes good responsiveness during the initial turn-in phase and should hopefully eliminate too much understeer. Comparing this to a time trial setup which would run the rear wing lower and front wing higher, you do have to build in some inherent understeer to a race setup. A time trial approach of say 50 front wing and 30 rear would simply have too much oversteer to comfortably manage through an entire race. Now Zandvoort does have a pretty unique layout, and there aren't many heavy traction zones throughout a lap, and this will let us increase our on-throttle differential to 65%. And we could even set this higher still if you do feel comfortable. This will give the car a good push through the faster corners, allowing for better high-speed traction and rotation. For the off-throttle diff, I have this balanced at 45%. Going much lower can help reduce a little more understeer, but it will start to introduce some unwanted mid-corner behaviour. Then much like the off-throttle diff, I've set the engine braking pretty balanced. This is high enough to achieve full ERS recovery each lap, but not too high that we can start to destabilise the car. Zandvoort does have a lot of medium speed to fast speed corners, which all benefit from a left-left camber setup. This will punish the tyres a little bit, but the performance gain outweighs the tyre wear, so I'd still recommend this route. I have set the front toe far left like most setups, then use the rear toe to stabilise the rear of the car a touch. Go with 0.18 on the rear toe setup. Now I spent most of my time with my Zandvoort setup adjusting the suspension. Due to the fast direction changes, you ideally want to run an incredibly stiff car at Zandvoort. However, if it's too stiff, the car can be prone to snap oversteer. I have still used a high gap between front and rear suspension, going with 39 and 3. The anti-roll bars have a larger than normal offset between front and rear as well, with a setup of 16 and 9. Setting the ARB stiffer can cause the car to get incredibly loose through turns 9, 10 and 12. I've taken a slight performance hit to allow for better consistency during a race, and you do still need to watch your throttle input at turn 10, as the car will want to rotate on the corner exit. Then go with the ride height of 23 and 60 to round out our Zandvoort suspension setup. For the brakes, I've gone back to our preferred pre-patch route of 98% pressure. You can really easily lock a brake, especially at turns 3 and 12, so dialing down the pressure can help to avoid this. Then go with a neutral brake bias of 54%. Now much like Spain, Zandvoort will really punish your tyres, but only on one side of the car. The left tyres will almost certainly overheat during a race, and this will be an area to manage. Due to the lack of left-hand corners, the right tyres will stay pretty cool. So I've run offset pressures to try and get the right of the car up to temperature, being careful not to run pressures that are too unbalanced. Go with 28 and 29.5 psi on the fronts, and 25.5 and 26.5 psi on the rears. The aero setup is the lowest that I've run at any track so far. I've gone with a front wing angle of 9 and rear wing that is right down at 0. This will eliminate as much drag as possible from the rear wing, while giving the front of the car enough downforce to reduce understeer. This setup approach will ensure that you're competitive down the straights, giving you the best opportunity to overtake and defend successfully. Now the transmission setup may look a little bit odd. Traction out of turn 2 and 5 are very important to give you a good run down the straights that follow, as well as ensuring you don't wear your rear tyres too fast due to wheel spin, and this is why I recommend setting the on-throttle differential down at just 20. During my testing through a full race distance, I did start with this set higher, but ultimately ended on 20% as a comfortable setup by the end of the race. The off-throttle differential is higher than many of our car setups so far, and that is mainly because I've set the engine braking to 100%. Setting the engine braking high does limit how low we can set the off-throttle diff, so I've gone with 60% on the off-throttle diff this time round. Now ERS recovery is a big issue at Monza, so setting the engine braking to 100% gives us the best chance of recovering as much energy per lap as possible. This high setup will help decelerate our car faster as well during those heavy braking zones. For the geometry, I've set the camber far left as per normal. Tyre wear isn't too much of an issue at Monza other than rear wear from wheel spin, so we can get away with this setup approach nice and easily. Then I've set the front toe out to 0.03 and rear toe in to 0.07. The front toe will add a touch more responsiveness at the front of the car, giving us a better initial turn-in. Understeer can be a problem at Monza, so this goes a little bit towards fixing that. The rear toe set to 0.07 will help keep the rear of the car stable. There are a couple of corners where the rear can get a little bit lively. Out of turns 6 and 7, the two Les modes, the rear can step out under acceleration. So the little bit of rear toe should help calm things down a little. Now the suspension setup is pretty stiff with a setup of 41 at the front and just 5 at the rear. This will help reduce understeer and allows us to run a low ride height. The anti-roll bars are set to 16 and 9, which is a pretty big difference from front to back, and this will just promote rear stability, much like the rear toe does. Then the ride height is set to 25 and 55, which is about as low as you'd want to go around Italy. You can hit some curbs, and the exit curbs at some corners are high enough to cause a bit of instability if you go too low. The brake setup for Monza is pretty much set in stone before you even set foot out of the garage. You've got to go with 100% brake pressure to slow your car as quick as possible, and 56% brake bias. This forward bias will help slow the car faster than a more rearward setup would, and the higher engine braking of 100% back in the transmission setup requires a more forward bias to avoid any rotation under braking. Tyre wear will be uneven at Monza simply due to the imbalance between left and right corners. The right side of the car will wear much slower than the left, so our tyre pressure setup targets those right tyres with lower pressures to help them stay hotter. Go 24.5 and 25.5 for the front tyres and 25.5 and 26.5 for the rears. Kicking things off with the aero, I've set the wings at 28 and 15. Now I'm going to say this early, there really isn't the perfect setup for your aero, as too much aero will make you faster through the majority of the lap, but incredibly slow down the long pit straight, which is really the only place to overtake. If you opt to lower the wings down, you can start to keep up with the AI in a straight line, but you'll lose performance through the rest of the lap. I've settled on 28 and 15, which is kind of a balance of the two options. It's not the fastest option when league racing or putting in time trial times. For those scenarios, more wing angle is preferable. During my testing with this setup, I was slower than the AI in a straight line and I had to use the DRS and ERS to execute overtakes. You can lower both front and rear wings by 2 to 5 clicks when heading into a race, and that should help with your top speed. The transmission setup is a bit easier to settle on. I've gone with 60% on throttle, which gives you good traction through the medium and high speed corners. Slow speed traction can be an issue as your tyres wear, so you may want to lower this a touch as you progress through a race. Then go with 40% for the off throttle diff and the engine braking setup. This prevents our car from over rotating, which can really be a problem through some of those 90-degree turns. For the geometry, our usual approach of left-left on the camber remains for Baku. Then add some toe to both the front and rear of the car. Go with 0.1 and 0.13 degrees. This gives us a bit more responsiveness that is lacking from our aero and transmission setup. And the toe in at the rear really helps with stability and getting the power down. Now I have softened our car compared to our usual car setups, so go with 34 and 7 this time. This is due to the larger curbs that you have to attack to be fast. The large apex curbs can really unsettle your car, so this softer approach allows you to ride them a little bit better. Then opt for a relatively stiff ARB setup of 15 and 12. This ensures you don't encounter too much body roll through the faster corner sequences. Then finally opt for a pretty low ride height of 22 and 55. This should be high enough for the majority of the circuit, but feel free to raise it up a couple of clicks if you really like to hit the curbs hard. For our recommended brake setup, I've opted for 100% pressure and a forward bias of 56%. This gives you good stopping power and stops the rear of the car from rotating on you, which can actually happen at a few places. Finally, our front tyre pressures are low as they do suffer from not getting up to temperature. I've opted for 23.5 psi and 22.5 psi for our fronts, and I've kept the rear pressures at maximum to keep our drag low whilst also managing tyre wear. There may be some long-ish straights around Singapore, however, opt for 50 and 48 on your aero setup. This ensures your car can carry as much speed as possible through the corners and remain responsive and compliant. There are a fair few chicanes and flowing corner sequences, and these fast direction changes really allow you to test your aero balance. This is why I have kept the rear aero pretty close to the front rather than opting for a large aero gap that's quite common with most of our car setups. With the transmission, I have the on-throttle diff set pretty balanced at 55%. While Singapore can test your traction from slow speed, it isn't as hard to accelerate without wheel spinning as it can be at some tracks. This lets us run a slightly higher on-throttle diff setup, then go 45% and 60% for the off-throttle diff and engine braking. This approach gives good ERS recovery, while using the medium engine braking to help rotate the car under braking slightly, but not cause too much instability. For our camber setup, I've gone with the left-left for both front and rear as per normal, then add a small amount of front toe, opting for 0.05, which will introduce a little bit more responsiveness. With the rear toe in, go with 0.2 for added stability. Our suspension setup is designed to add drivability, which will help with consistency throughout longer races. Go with 36 and 4 on the suspension, and this is soft enough to allow you to hit some of those curbs while remaining stiff enough at the front for good rotation. The anti-roll bars are set to 16 and 11, which will help ensure the car's rear doesn't over-rotate on you, and this will give you a solid platform to push the car for faster lap times. Finally, the ride height is a little higher than at some tracks, simply due to those curbs and the nature of this street circuit. Go with 25 and 60 front and rear. Set the brake pressure to 100% for good deceleration, and choose a brake bias of 55%. Any further forward can lead to a locked wheel at slower speed, while moving this further rearward is really a no-go with our current engine braking setup. Like other street tracks in F124 including Monaco, the tyres can struggle to get up to temperature a little bit. To solve this, we can lower the pressures all round, particularly at the front. Go 24 and 23 psi on the front tyres and just 24.5 on both rears. Your rear tyres will take more punishment than the front, so the increased rear pressures will go some way towards protecting them during a race. Now, some time trial setups may push the front wing right up to 50 or really close to it. However, as we've come to learn, when racing offline, the AI is incredibly fast in a straight line. Opting for a front wing of 50 will lead to us being left in the dust along the long straight after turn 11. Instead, I've opted for a front wing aero of 41 and rear wing of 35. This is about as high as I could run while still being able to keep up with the AI in a straight line. Understeer can really hurt your lap time at Qatar, so setting the rear wing lower will help your car rotate a little bit. With such a variety of corners, deciding on a transmission setup can also be hard. Much like Bahrain, you'll need to compromise between high-speed traction and eliminating slow-speed wheel spin. I have opted for 65% on-throttle differential, combined with 50% off-throttle and 70% engine braking. We can run the engine braking slightly higher at 70% to help our car rotate a little bit better. Now, the recommended route for the geometry is to maximise cornering grip, which requires the camber set all the way to the left as per normal. I've also set the front toe to 0 to minimise drag, and it isn't really required as we can achieve good rotation responsiveness thanks to other parts of our car setup. I have added rear toe, putting it up to 0.2 to ensure the rear of the car remains stable, particularly through the more technical sector of turns 12 to 16. Now, I did mention that a stiff suspension is beneficial for Qatar, and I have gone this route with a slightly watered down approach to help with tyre wear and stability. Set your front suspension to 38 and the rear to 8, then go with ARBs of 16 and 11. This will provide a stiff enough base for the car to respond well to direction change without punishing your tyres quite as hard. The much lower rear anti-roll bar will also help reduce any unwanted behaviour in the mid to late corner phase. I've then opted for a ride height of 25 and 57. Now, despite its undulations and elevation change, the track surface itself is pretty smooth, with a few bumps down that long straight. This medium ride height setup will prevent our car from hitting any part of the track and reducing our top speed. The brake bias setup needs to be a little more forward for Qatar. There are a few big stops which benefit from a brake bias of 56%, but more importantly, any further rearward would mean we would have to lower our engine braking, which is a less preferable route. Then, as always, opt for a brake pressure of 100%. Now, some parts of this recommended car setup are designed with limiting tyre wear in mind, and that is because Qatar can wear your tyres heavily. So I've kept all tyre pressures to their maximum to prevent too much overheating and too much wear through a race. You may think that the sheer number of slow speed corners will result in a higher downforce car setup than I've actually recommended. I've set the front wing to 35 and the rear to just 22. Much like tracks such as Baku or Qatar, Mexico has an incredibly long straight that does limit how much downforce you can run. So I've set the wing angles low enough to be competitive down that straight, but the more important aspect of creating an aero setup here is creating a big gap between the front and rear of the car. This will allow your car to pivot well into those slower corners and remain responsive. For the transmission, I've set the on-throttle differential fairly high. This track is dependent on slow speed traction, so 60% may seem a little bit high. However, you actually have quite a lot of mechanical grip at this track, so you can run a higher on-throttle differential setup without encountering too much wheel spin. If you do find yourself sliding out of some of those slower corners, first try to open up your steering on the exit. You can use a lot of track and a lot of curb around Mexico, and this can really help limit wheel spin. Alternatively, you can also lower your on-throttle differential. I have then set the off-throttle diff to 55%, and this is relatively high, but it's necessitated by the high engine braking of 80%. Higher engine braking setups require higher off-throttle differential setups. For the geometry, I've kept everything far left. That means running the camber at its highest negative angle to give us great grip mid-corner, which is very useful through turns 7 to 11, which is incredibly fast. The lack of any toe will help reduce drag and increase our top speed along that pit straight, and it will also limit tyre wear, which can be a big problem at this track. When it comes to the suspension setup, responsiveness is key. I've set the front suspension high at 40 and the rear to just 6. This, combined with anti-roll bars of 19 and 15, will result in a car that is very willing to change direction and go where you point it. This track is pretty smooth, however you will want to attack the curbs a lot, which leads to a slightly higher than liked ride height. Setting this to 25 and 58 gives us a little leeway when riding up and over the curbs and avoids bottoming out. With the brakes, I'd recommend our normal approach of 100% pressure and 55% bias. Lockups aren't too much of an issue, but you can actually encounter some rear locking at some corners, so 55% provides a good balance. Now, I did mention it earlier, but Mexico is punishing on tyres, and there are some fast corners which really stress the front tyres, and plenty of slower corners that can wear your rears. For this reason, I've maxed out all pressures other than the front right tyre, which I have lowered to 28.5, and that will complete this car setup for Mexico. Our aero setup is really tailored towards that middle sector rather than the two long straights. I recommend using 40 on the front wing and just 25 on the rear. Balance is important throughout a lap, however the slower and medium speed corners don't really test your car's rear stability overly much. This lets us run a large gap between front and rear wings to really promote rotation, which is important through the middle sector as well as in the tricky first corner sequence. Because many of Brazil's corners are quite long and flowing, wheel spin isn't too much of an issue. There aren't many heavy traction zones, which lets us set the on-throttle differential relatively high at 65%. Combining with the large gap between front and rear wings, I have set the off-throttle differential low at 35%, which will really promote good rotation. The engine braking therefore can't be too high, but it's still high enough to give us good ERS recovery each lap at 60%. I've kept our suspension geometry set far left for all values other than the tiniest little bit of rear toe in. The largest angles of negative camber are really important throughout a lap of Brazil as you lean so heavily on your tyres through the twisting turns. I've included just 0.02 degrees of rear toe to help ever so slightly with a little rear stability. The suspension follows the trend of the rest of this car setup by promoting rotation and creating a really agile car. Go with 40 on the front suspension and just 4 on the rear. Then set your anti-roll bars to 18 and 13, which is pretty high for a race setup. As I mentioned at the start, rear stability isn't too much of an issue, so we can push our anti-roll bar setup a little bit stiffer. Ride height is a big talking point though around Interlagos. I've set this high at 26 and 60, but even with this setup, you will scrape the ground at a few points. You'll notice this most on the run to the first corner, however this scraping doesn't impact your top speed. Set the brake pressure to 100% like normal, then go with a brake bias of 53%. Choosing a brake bias can be really tricky, as some corners such as turn 1 can result in front brake lock-in, while others can lead to rear brake lock-in, especially turns 8 and 10. Ideally, you want to adjust your brake bias manually throughout a lap, which you can do with your MFD. However, if you can't do this, 53% is a solid route. With so many corners that come at you so fast, it's no surprise our tyres will get hot around Brazil. I've set all tyre pressures to their maximum values to promote as much temperature offset as possible. This also has the added benefit of allowing for greater top speeds compared to the AI due to less drag. We're kicking things off with our aero setup, and for Las Vegas we have to run Monza style wing angles. There are a few long straights that really emphasise straight line performance. Opt for 7 at the front and 0 at the rear of the car. You won't lose too much straight line performance from the front wing set to 7, due to the top speed and drag mainly being affected by the rear wing. The offset between front and rear is important to get your car rotated into the slow speed corners. As we'll be primarily accelerating from slow and medium speed, an on-throttle differential that isn't too high is important to reduce wheel spin. I've set the on-throttle diff to 50%, which is a good route for this track. I've set the off-throttle diff a touch lower than the on-throttle at 40% and the engine braking to 50%. As I mentioned, braking is incredibly important around Las Vegas, so not being too aggressive with either of these setup options is important. With the geometry, I've taken our normal approach with the camber set all the way to the left, as well as the front toe set to 0. I've added a little rear toe in at 0.05 just to help with rear stability a little bit. This comes in handy when accelerating hard out of turns 1, 9 and 16. I've set our suspension to be pretty stiff with 40 at the front and just 4 at the rear. This allows the car to respond well and rotate into the slower corners better. The anti-roll bars set at 16 and 11 give us enough stability under acceleration so that the car won't over-rotate during the mid to late corner phase. Being a street track, Las Vegas isn't the smoothest circuit on the calendar, so a ride height of 24 and 60 will provide us enough ground clearance so bottoming out won't be an issue. For the brake setup, I've opted for 100% pressure to slow the car from high speed really well. I've then set the brake bias to 55%. Moving this any further forward and you can encounter front lock-in, especially into turns 7 and 12. Any further rearward and you may experience the odd bout of rear lock-in, meaning 55 is just right. Being a night track with the long straights, our tyres are going to stay cool pretty well. Too well in fact. I've had to set the front tyre pressures as low as they can go at 22.5 psi to help them maintain temperature, and I've lowered the rears slightly away from the maximum at 25.5 and 25 psi. For my recommended aero setup, I've got things set pretty high. This gives the best overall lap time during qualifying, so go with 44 on the front wing and 40 on the rear. Now I'm going to say this now, but you might want to reduce this by a few clicks when heading into a race, as the AI will be running a much lower downforce setup. You'll see in the gameplay in this video that during the corner sequences I can easily keep up with the AI with this higher downforce approach. I have run a much smaller wing gap to really ensure this setup gives you a car that can be pushed hard throughout a lap. The close gap between front and rear wings can lead to a touch of understeer at some corners, so we've countered this with our transmission setup. I've set the on-throttle diff to 60%, which gives you a good push out of the faster corners. I've then gone with a low off-throttle diff setup of 35% and a higher engine braking setup of 70. This combination will allow your car to be a little freer under braking and rotate better into some of the corners. Now Qatar really tests your car's ability to lean on its tyres and carry speed through a turn. Due to this, I've set the geometry all the way left on all of the options. This gives us the largest amount of negative camber, helping with corner speed, and the minimal toe helps to reduce drag. I've gone with a fairly aggressive approach to our suspension setup due to the corner styles at this track. Opt for 36 and 9 on the suspension, which is actually pretty soft compared to some tracks. However, pair this with a stiff anti-roll bar setup of 19 and 15. Higher ARBs will improve our performance mid-corner, and at this circuit, with this car setup, instability isn't too much of an issue. Losail is incredibly smooth, mainly thanks to it being a MotoGP track for many years, and this lets us run an incredibly low ride height at just 25 and 52. With the brake setup, opt for 100% pressure and just 54% bias. There are a few corners where you'll be braking and rotating the car at the same time, so a slightly more rearward bias is preferable. Finally, this track is incredibly tough on tyre wear. Not quite to the same level as Spain, but not far off. You should run almost maximum tyre pressures to try and limit the wear, with just the front right pressure being slightly lower at 29 psi. The track layout that was integrated a few years ago have made this circuit a much faster and has lowered the lap time by over 10 seconds. And this is a track that's gone from being tricky and slow in places to flowing really nicely, and it's actually a great end to the Formula 1 calendar. The aero setup for Abu Dhabi is much different from the setups we would have run if the track still included the slow chicanes that were removed a few years ago. This is now a much more low downforce track, allowing us to run wing angles of 37 at the front and 27 at the rear. This approach may not be really low downforce, but it provides good responsiveness, rotation and decent enough top speed for those two long straights in the middle sector. You'll find that this year you have much better rear traction at this circuit, allowing you to really push the car hard. For the transmission setup, go with on-throttle differential of 60%. Much like the aero, the updated track layout lets us run a more locked differential for better outright traction at higher speed. Then opt for a fairly aggressive off-throttle and engine braking combination of 40 and 80%. This works with the aero setup to provide very good rotation, especially into the slower corners such as turns 5 and 6. We may be nearing the end of the tracks in F1 24, but it's no surprise that our camber once again follows the same route as our other car setups, set at both front and rear camber far left, as this will provide the highest possible mid-corner grip. For the toe, I've added some front toe at 0.05 and even more rear toe in at 0.1. This helps us achieve stability and the correct amount of responsiveness that we need from the car. With the suspension, I've gone with a really aggressive approach, and this works well at this track as the layout doesn't really test the car too much with bumps and high loads like many circuits do. Go with 40 and 8 on the suspension setup and 20 and 15 on the anti-roll bar setup. This gives us a really responsive car that has very good mechanical grip mid-corner. Then set the ride height pretty high at 27 and 59. You will be hitting a few curbs around Abu Dhabi, and there is actually a nasty dip on the exit curb of turn 1. And this leads us to setting the ride height ever so slightly higher than we would have desired. With the brake setup, go with 100% pressure, 55% brake bias for good consistency throughout a lap. And for the tyre pressures, maximising all pressures will help somewhat with tyre wear and temperature build-up. Our aggressive geometry, transmission and suspension setup are all performance focused, leading us to increased tyre wear throughout a race. Maximum pressures do help control this a bit, and also help with our top speed by eliminating some friction and drag. You'll get a good combination of slow, medium and high speed turns at this track, and that leads to a medium to high downforce car setup. There really is only one long straight, and the constant elevation change can cause havoc with your car's balance and downforce. Set the front wing to 38 and the rear to 30. This gap between front and rear is less than at most tracks, and that's to ensure the rear of the car stays planted. There are plenty of corners where the rear of the car can get away from you, in particular turn 4 as you crest over the hill. If you feel the car still feels a bit too light, I suggest lowering the front wing a few clicks to bring the balance a little bit more towards the rear of the car. We have to be fairly conservative with the on-throttle differential as you can easily light up your rear tyres. Keep this set to 50% and then opt for 40% off-throttle diff and 70% engine braking. Due to the focus on rear stability with this setup, you'll constantly feel like your car is understeering a little bit. The high engine braking and low to medium off-throttle differential do help a little bit to rotate the car in lower speed corners. With the geometry, I've focused on good minimum corner speed and mid-corner grip with our camber setup all the way to the left. Then keep your front toe set to 0 and add 0.2 degrees of rear toe in. This will shore up the rear of the car to help it stay facing the right way. For the suspension, you could think that you may need to go really soft due to all those hills, but actually a stiffer suspension approach works really well. Opt for 38 at the front and just 5 at the rear. I have softened the anti-roll bars down to 13 and 8 to give us good stability throughout a lap. And I believe this is one of the lowest ARB setups I've run all year. Round out the suspension setup with your ride height set to 27 and 60. and this is just to prevent the car bottoming out through some of the dips and over the curbs. Braking around Portimao is tricky, so I've had to lower the pressure to just 98% to prevent lockups. Then pair this with 54% brake bars to further reduce the risk of front locking. Tyre wear can be an issue, so set the pressures high with the front right at 28.5 psi and all other tyres set at their maximum values. And this will complete our recommended Portugal car setup F1 24. This is a thoroughly enjoyable circuit, and I'm glad that EA have included it in this year's game. With this setup, the car feels really well balanced, allowing you to push harder than you might be able to with a more aggressive performance-focused car setup. Now we have completed dry car setups for every track in F1 24, so let's celebrate by hitting that like button below. I will be releasing a lot more F1 24 content. I'll be looking at wet setups and other F1 24 guides and tips videos. If you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see, leave them in the comments below, and consider subscribing to be notified every time we drop a new video. But for now guys, enjoy this track, enjoy all of our dry car setups, and I will see you out on track.